let me just introduce them, and then I'll subside. So I'm Peter Levine from Tufts University. I'm the panel chair, but I won't be presenting. Sarah Sitzline is the author, the writer. This is her paper, but we did engage with her a lot on it. We did share a lot of ideas, and I think our team really strongly endorsed it and are very proud of it. But Sarah's definitely the author and to be credited that way. And she is professor of education and also affiliate in philosophy at the University of Cincinnati. She's written several books. She's very prolific. The most recent one, which I very much enjoyed, is American Public Education and the Responsibility of Its Citizens, which is Oxford University Press 2017. And she has a book coming out called Learning How to Hope, Reviving Democracy in America, which we will need. So she's the author. My two colleagues who kind of work with me as Sarah's sort of thought partners, Tony Layden and Jennifer Morton. So Tony Layden is professor and also chair of philosophy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Prolific author as well. The most relevant and recent book is his book Reasoning, A Social Picture, OUP 2012, which really converted me to his view, for what it's worth. You be the judge, but I was really converted to a radically different view of reasoning by that book, which is a fascinating book. And then Jennifer Morton has just moved to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So she's a professor of philosophy there. And her recent book, which is getting a lot of very well-deserved attention because it's a really important book on an understudied topic, is The Ethical Costs of Upward Mobility. That's Princeton 2019. And then I wasn't sure if I should introduce Bill Galston or not, but I will anyway. So Bill's the discussant. Bill was my boss for 10 years or so, and of course, good friend. Is at the Brookings Institution, has had other jobs, including in the White House, working with Bill Clinton, and is the author of many, many books. The most recent is very relevant. It's 2018. It's Anti-Pluralism, the Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy. So bunch of authors of important books on related topics, and they have a plan to present, but I think Sarah's basically in charge, so I'm going to yield to her.
All right, thanks, Peter. Good morning, everyone. You'll hear mostly from my voice today, but from time to time, Tony and Jennifer will be chiming in with parts of our presentation. Following in the spirit of Greg and Carol, who both called this an experiment this morning, I suppose going first means our group gets to be the guinea pig. So I'm going to embrace that model of being the guinea pig this morning. So our
Sarah, you might want to hold on a second. I'm having some trouble sharing the screen.
Okay.
Let me see. Oh, here we go.
This is part of the guinea pig life. We have to sort it all out and figure out how to make it work.
There we go. That should. Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Talking, Jen, while you sort out the slides?
Okay.
There we go. All right. So our group was tasked with exploring the philosophical and moral underpinnings of civic reasoning and discourse. And I think when Peter just introduced us, it probably comes as no surprise that a group of philosophers chose to go about this as mostly a conceptual inquiry, where we're trying to kind of illuminate for you some of the key concepts that underlie all of the panels in your papers today. And if you recall, during our February Zoom call, Walter Parker suggested that our group should go first. And we got on board with that idea because we saw that some of the definitions that we use in our paper might be helpful for unifying the other papers and panels today so that we're all on the same page. So most of our presentation is going to be focused on emphasizing those shared definitions, and we'll say a little bit, but far less, about some of the current obstacles to quality civic reasoning that we identified, and some of the kind of calls for future research that come later in our paper. Our starting point is what we see as the key civic question, and that is, what should we do? Of course, this question comes up whenever a group of people faces a problem or has to make a decision, But it also comes up when citizens are trying to figure out how to live together, how to form relationships with each other. And so we want to start by kind of breaking down what this question is. And this is an approach we're actually borrowing here from Peter. Starting with the what. The what are those tangible or meaningful products of our discussions and our actions? So these could be actual things that we produce together. They could be decisions that we reach, or they could be norms that we construct, norms that shape how we interact with each other. So in a lot of cases, these are real, tangible, empirical things. They depend on facts and on evidence. The second part of the question is should. Obviously a normative word here. It's about how do we better or improve our relations together, the situations we find ourselves in, how do we solve problems. These are things that push us beyond what we merely can or what we want to do into making a claim about what it's right for us to do or what we might have an ethical responsibility to do. And then the we term. This is a term that emphasizes our shared fate in this together, in our collaboration and addressing issues we face, and in our responsibilities to each other. Of course, an individual might ask, what should I do? And that's a worthy question to pursue, but it becomes civic when it's about our impact on or our action together as a we. I want to pause briefly here to say a little bit more about how we're defining this we. Of course, in a liberal democracy, a citizen is typically understood as someone who has a set of rights. But we try to go beyond this to follow James Tolley's understanding of a civic notion of citizenship. So that's based on the practices of what people do in a group or in a context. So that includes engaging in this question, what should we do? So in other words, you don't have to be granted formal legal citizenship in order to practice civic citizenship. So to be a part of that we. Now, that said, we recognize that this we can't be assumed. We have long histories of injustice and exclusion that certainly reveal how some people are included and others are not. And we'll hear, I'm sure, a little bit more about that from the History of Civics Education panel later today. So part of answering the civic question is working through those past exclusions and creating new and more inclusive understandings of who counts as the we. And the final word in our civic question is do. Action. Actions we take together. They might also entail engaging in discussion or deliberation. Could be community building, just figuring out how to live together well. The emphasis here is on what we can achieve rather than what we might expect others to do. So getting into the heart of some of the definitions that our paper lays out, the first being civic reasoning. We see civic reasoning as the sort of reasoning we do as we answer the question, what should we do? So in other words, circular, so bear with it. And then we define civic discourse as the means or the method by which groups of people engage in civic reasoning. So given our nature as largely social and interdependent beings who construct knowledge and solutions together, civic discourse is one of the ways that we reason together through discussion and through deliberation to answer what should we do. Civic discourse is also a social endeavor. It's one of the ways that we relate to each other. And civic discourse then offers certain benefits that we rarely can achieve when engaging in civic reasoning alone, that individual asking these sorts of questions. Let me turn it over to Tony, who's going to say a little bit more.
So we thought that one way to think about the special skills and dispositions and values needed to engage in civic reasoning well, it helps to notice that civic reasoning is civic in 3 different senses. And each sense sort of points us towards a different dimension along which civic reasoning is a particular kind of reasoning. So first, it's civic in topic. Can people hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Just unnerving to not know what's going on. So 3 ways in which civic reasoning is civic. First, it's civic in topic. So it's reasoning we do about civic matters, such as how should we live our shared life together. And so it needs to be shaped by accurate knowledge about civic matters. Second, it's the reasoning of civic actors. So the reasons that we exchange when we're engaged in civic reasoning have to be reasons for people insofar as they are civic actors or citizens. And in addition to this, part of what we do when we engage in civic reasoning as civic actors is to work out just who we are, right? Who composes that we and what our capacities and differences are. And then third, it's civic in manner. So it's a way of reasoning with our fellow civic actors that treats them as free and equal co-authors of our shared lives. And so it has to be responsive and reciprocal and done with respect for each other and their positions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who will talk about how this connects to democracy.
Great. So I will talk a little bit about civic reasoning as a form of democratic living. So civic reasoning is a plural and ethical endeavor that often entails inquiry, empirical investigation, and engagement with the emotions. So civic reasoning is plural because rarely do individuals have the wisdom, the power, or the resources to undertake tackling questions such as what we should do alone. And civic reasoning is ethical because answering those questions together entails interacting with each other in ways that impact those both in and outside the group, and also that we treat each other with respect and grant each other equal standing in making different claims. Now, civic reasoning can happen in all sorts of places, private companies or religious organizations, in our classrooms. So our paper tries to hone in on how it relates to democracy in particular. And here we go back to a very Deweyan notion of democracy as both a system of government, but also a way of life, particularly a way of life that promotes and relies upon civic reasoning and discourse. So democratic citizens not only self-govern and consent to laws, but also actively work with others to form publics around shared problems, to pose solutions, and to engage in creative imagining about how their future might be improved. So we saw this just recently with the coronavirus. We all imaginatively came together to figure out solutions around people not being able to travel. And that's kind of an example of the broad sense of civic reasoning that we're employing here. This kind of reasoning and discourse keeps democracy healthy by welcoming a plurality of perspectives, highlighting that we have shared responsibilities for sustained and improved living, and integrating citizens into decision-making about the future of our communities and building a collective sense of we. Focusing on the second sense in which reasoning is civic, that of the identity of the reasoners, distinguishes how one might answer the civic question as a citizen, rather than say as a scientific expert in a scientific community or a self-interested individual. From the civic perspective, we're thinking about the we, about us doing something together. Publics often require responsibility and work on the part of citizens who must uphold or revise the aims and values of the group while engaging in collaboration and action around shared interests and stakes. In this way, being a citizen is more than just a legal status, but rather an identity we form relative to each other as we work together. And so here, again, like we've been seeing that happening around this crisis that we're living through, and how different parts of our community are coming together to figure out what we should do.
So
I'll turn it over to Sarah again.
The key components of civic reasoning and discourse generally fall into categories of knowledge, skills, values, and dispositions. And our group struggled a little bit with figuring out what falls into each of these buckets. So I think it's important that we want to say that these categories don't always have firm or clear distinctions. They can relate to and they can build upon one another. But we'll walk through with you today some of these buckets. And we want to start with knowledge and skills. And in the paper, we go into more detail about inquiry, fact-finding, negotiating truth, reasonableness, critical thinking, discussion, and deliberation. We'll touch on a few of those here briefly. Starting with inquiry. So inquiry tends to begin when we're stuck, when we're unsure how to proceed, when we're first forced to stop and figure out and to ask, what should we do? Inquiry, of course, is that process that we use to investigate our world, to hypothesize or come up with suggestions for improved ways of living within that world or navigating a situation, and then experimenting with them to gauge their usefulness and to move forward. Publics then can form around that problem and then they take up that question, what should we do? Of course, historical and political knowledge is often required then in order to answer the question. That sort of historical and political knowledge helps us understand what have others tried in the past, what resources do we have to work with now. So historical and political knowledge is what gives us the know-how and the confidence to solve the question, what should we do? When reading our earlier draft, Walter Parker pushed us to say more about the sorts of content knowledge needed, which raises the kind of what questions of curriculum. And we do touch on some of those in the longer report. We won't go into detail about them here, and much of it's already included in both the history group panel, the disciplines and developmental learning, and as well as in the digital media panel. So I'm sure we'll get into more detail about those in the upcoming sessions. But returning back, inquiry and knowledge often hinge on finding, analyzing, interpreting, agreeing upon, making judgments from it, and reaching conclusions about facts. Creating knowledge is a social endeavor. It often requires citizens to trust each other and to trust institutions, places like scientific organizations and news agencies, places where facts are determined. And Tony's going to say a little bit about our next bucket here.
Thanks. So there's a lot of controversy about the place of reasoning in civic life that I think comes from not fully distinguishing various skills that are involved in good reasoning, and so failing to distinguish categories that look the same makes philosophers prickly. So we try and draw some distinctions between logic, rationality, reasonableness, and critical thinking. So let me say a little bit about what we mean by those terms. So logic concerns formal inferential relations between statements. So how the formal structure of our language allows us to make steps in an argument, and how those steps are connected. And so understanding how to make good logical arguments and spot bad ones is essential for good reasoning, but it's not sufficient because most arguments involve citing reasons that offer substantive support for a conclusion. So citing evidence or urging considerations of prudence, morality, or justice. And so we use the term rationality to describe the skills that are needed to understand how reasons substantively support conclusions and how reasons relate to one another, because reasons relate to one another in all sorts of complex ways, and rationality involves understanding how that works. Then we want to say that not everything we do that we call reasoning involves offering and evaluating considerations in favor of or against a conclusion or decision. So there's some things we do that we call reasoning, which I like to refer to as reasoning together. And civic reasoning is a form of that. It's an activity that requires not only rationality, but reasonableness as a skill. And we use the term reasonableness to capture the set of skills that go into this activity of reasoning together, which involves engaging reciprocally and responsively with one another. And so reasonableness involves skills of listening to others, willingness to be moved by what other people say, and an attempt to search out common ground. And then finally, we give a particular spin to critical thinking. So critical thinking, I think, is often used to cover a very wide range of heterogeneous skills, but we reserve it to cover a particular set of skills associated with thinking critically about relations of power. And so one way to think about critical thinkers in our sense is that they're involved in raising important who questions. That is, who's being heard? Is everyone at the table who needs to be? Who stands to gain or lose by certain decisions and certain policy outcomes? All right, Jen's going to talk about discussion and deliberation.
Great, yeah. So we define discussion and deliberation following the precedent of Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy and other panelists who have covered this, and we'll cover it in the pedagogies panel. So we're not going to go into great detail here, but we do want to point out that discussion and deliberation often involve being open, reasoning in good faith with others, being vulnerable and willing to listen to the perspective of others, and crucially, confronting dissent. So in particular, when we have members of marginalized groups or marginalized minorities who might not be heard or treated equally in the context of discussion and deliberation, we often have to be comfortable with and welcome dissent, because often that can expose the fact that there might be different points of view that are getting overlooked or that are getting silenced. And so dealing and confronting with dissent in the context of discussion and deliberation is going to be a key part of reasoning in a civic manner. All right, now I'll turn it over to Sarah.
So we want to do a little more definitional work here by laying out how we understand values, dispositions, and virtues. We use the term values to refer to ideas and ideals that people hold dear. Our values guide our actions by helping us to determine, whether a course of action or a given social situation is good or desirable. It's what we want. Dispositions are traits of character that orient individuals to care about and act on certain values. And then virtues, these are excellences of character. So they involve not only being disposed properly to given values, but also the capacity to see clearly, when a value is relevant to a situation and to act decisively in response to that value. So values, virtues, and dispositions play a role in civic reasoning in at least three ways. First, we see that the very activity of civic reasoning embodies and relies on certain values and virtues to be done well. So these include things like empathy and a willingness to compromise, a concern to find consensus, a collaborative spirit, and civility. These can all improve the quality of civic reasoning, and this makes them what we might call, civic virtues. Second, in the course of engaging in civic reasoning, we invoke and contest commitments to various values. So these could be political values like liberty and equality and toleration, but they could also be values that are more particular to our given problem that we're addressing or our identities as reasoners. And then third, civic reasoning can generate new understandings of or new commitments to various values. So civic reasoning can be a part of the process by which citizens come to develop or shift their dispositions toward values. So civic reasoning can help citizens to develop the virtues necessary to pursue those values well. Civic education that's designed to improve the quality of civic discourse has to familiarize students with the values that have played a role in civic reasoning in a given country, including the various debates over how to understand those values and their relationship to one another. So, here in the United States, that includes values like liberty and equality and justice. The way that we answer the civic question, what should we do, is often then a realization of our values. So we don't just have to figure out facts or locate the right knowledge, we also have to deal with values, including how they shape what we even count as facts. To answer the civic question well, we need the ability to think and talk about values, including what they are, how they relate to each other, and how they're best achieved. And we have to be prepared to trade off one value for another, or to resolve tensions between competing or conflicting values when we're working in publics. So this all, requires that we're able to articulate what our values are, to describe them and qualify why they're important to us and to what extent. And it requires being able to detect the values of others and engage in discussion and negotiation about them. Jen's going to say a little bit about empathy in particular.
Great. So another critical capacity here is empathy. And that for us means working to see the world from another's perspective. And empathy can help us to overcome some of the impediments to listening and can improve our ability to relate to each other civically. Now, empathy is aided by dispositions such as openness to hear from others and learn from others, and understanding of our own proclivities and limitations. Openness to how others might reshape us, and imagination to cross the boundaries between us, to be able to see the world from the other's perspective. And here we follow another contributor to these panels, Nicole Mira, by using her definition of critical civic empathy. And key to this definition is that it's a notion of empathy that acknowledges power inequalities, historicity, and positionality. So it works to foster understanding across differences and ways to build a new identity together as citizens, one oriented towards equity-oriented action. So another key notion that we discuss in the paper involves consensus and compromise and how these relate to civility. So I'm going to say a little bit about consensus and compromise and then turn it to Tony to talk about civility. Consensus entails coming to unanimously consent to the same conclusion or the same preference or desire, even though not all differences between individuals' desires or conclusions may be resolved. Aiming at consensus can help us build solidarity and could produce a sense of being united with other citizens. And it entails being willing to compromise, which means striking a deal between one's desires or the conclusion that one seeks to have the group come to and someone else's desires or conclusions. And it might be that we have to give up parts of what we want in order to reach an agreement with those whose views differ from one's own. So aiming a compromise can help us arrive at necessary agreement when we are in deep disagreement otherwise, or to create neutral or mutually acceptable ground between groups or individuals that might have strong disagreements. On some occasions, consensus or compromise are aims we hope to achieve through reasoning and discourse, and in those instances, the achievement of consensus or compromise may be seen as an indication of fulfilling the common good or having achieved mutually beneficial goals as a sign of success. But in other occasions, they might be a means for engaging in discourse and reasoning well. They might be the motivation that leads us to engage in the kind of civic discourse that we've been discussing. Now I'll turn it over to Tony to talk about civility.
Right, so civility is generally cited as a key virtue for good reasoning and discourse. And we draw a distinction between two forms that civility is often thought to take, or two different conceptions of civility. So it's often thought as a form of politeness, right? So being civil in this sense involves behaving according to a set of rules of behavior for civic participation. And one problem with that conception of civility is that it can be used to exclude certain voices and modes of engagement that are nevertheless reasonable in our sense. That is, people who are engaged in civic practices with one another, but who don't follow some status quo preserving sets of rules. And so we recommend a different understanding of civility as responsiveness. And thinking of civility as being responsive makes civility part of reasonableness in our sense. And so like reasonableness, it's a cooperative virtue. It's a thing that allows us to cooperate well together, and thus allows us to think about things like reaching consensus or aiming at consensus through compromise. So civility is responsiveness then requires being open to engaging and cooperating with others on fully equal terms that fully respect their participation and contributions. And it shows itself in such behavior as active and attentive listening, striving to hear and take seriously, in particular, unfamiliar and uncomfortable positions and challenges, and not insisting on one's own perspective or one's own particular moral or religious position as the only basis for public discussion, right? So being open to other ways of thinking and approaching questions. And I think Sarah's gonna bring us home with obstacles and future research.
Yeah, so all of our panels were, tasked with addressing obstacles in the future. And of course, some of these come about by the very way we've defined us in our report. The first is, we take on the changing nature of truth and facts and inquiry, especially in this kind of post-truth world and in our hyper-partisan communities where, fake news is widely circulated. The second is the changing nature of human psychology. This, recent hyper-partisanships having a marked impact on the makeup of our groups and the reasoning that occurs within them. Increasingly, citizens are, seeking out echo chambers and surrounding themselves with peers and news sources that confirm their particular worldview. And as a result, increasingly citizens are led astray in their reasoning by confirmation bias, by motivated reasoning, and more. So we tackle those briefly in the report. A third one are struggles in online settings. Given the prevalence of using online spaces to find facts in particular, problems related to sources and verification are especially prevalent today. And in those online spaces, many people are sometimes irresponsible in their employment of facts. So consumers of online information then have to employ, a heightened level of scrutiny and care as they determine what the facts are. We think the digital media panel has done an exceptionally good job of handling some of those issues in their report, and I'm looking forward to discussing those later. Another potential obstacle in future research is the need for more open, diverse, and inclusive communities. Open environments where citizens are invited to discuss meaningful and controversial issues can help build inclusivity and tolerance, especially when participants discover that they learn from and improve their overall decision-making process as a result of including multiple and conflicting perspectives. Yet, even though we know that's a benefit, civic and classroom deliberations are often in many ways exclusive. And of course, this situation is worsened by increasing socioeconomic and racial segregation in our communities and in our schools. Alleviating school-based obstacles is also big for us. So this means things like a lack of time and attention being devoted to the skills and knowledge and disposition necessary for civic reasoning and discourse. And of course, this is true in key disciplinary areas like history and social studies, but also even when these topics are overlooked in mathematics and science and literacy education. And finally, we recognize that not all citizens need to learn the exact same things in order to be prepared for good civic reasoning and discourse. We can actually, bring differing and complementary components together to produce good civic reasoning and discourse. And it's significant that not everyone is equally situated in our society as equal reasoning partners. And some of the components that we've depicted here have long been wrapped up with practices of injustice and inequity in America. Some have been systematically denied to Americans of color or those with less power or wealth. On the other hand, the reasoning of citizens inhabiting positions of privilege is also, sometimes undermined by an array of limitations that arise from their privilege, some of which are overlooked or downplayed because they are common amongst powerful or mainstream people. And then recognizing that demographics and injustice impact participation and the development of citizenship, our schools may need to vary the knowledge and the skills and dispositions and values that they teach. So for example, given inequitable starting positions, some people need to develop assertiveness while others need to learn humility. So schools are going to have to, vary those across locations. And then Jen just has a couple words to wrap us up here.
Sure. In conclusion, we've really tried to offer some helpful definitions of civic reasoning in this course centered on the question, what should we do? And following Peter's work, we thought that was a good place to start for articulating the moral foundations for civic discourse. And so we've tried to articulate some of those moral foundations and some of the educational implications for developing the sorts of knowledge, skills, and dispositions and values that we need to answer that civic question well. And our hope is that this will provide a working foundation for the other panel's reports. Thank you. And I guess I'll stop. Does that work? All right.
So actually the discussant for the Philosophical Foundations panel, Dr. Bill Gelston, is here with us. So, okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
It would actually be better if you can speak at the podium, or you're welcome to do it.
I'll be happy to speak at the podium. But I do have a question for the chair first. I received an assignment, but not a time limit, and I don't want to overstay my welcome. So please give me some advice as to how long I should comment.
We were saying 10 minutes, but you can go longer. 20 would be getting into a problem.
Okay.
But that's not working.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
There we go. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the chair and the other members of the steering committee for including me in this very ambitious venture. I'll try to make as many of my points as I can in the time allowed, and perhaps others will come up in the more extended discussion. The chair asked or put on the table a very important question in her opening remarks, namely, are we just talking to one another? And that question will hover over my remarks. I'd also note that there are some presiding deities in this paper, specifically John Rawls and John Dewey. They are both important guides to civic discourse, but I would say they are not infallible guides. And I'd like to try to flesh that out a little bit. I'm going to proceed, my comments are going to proceed in 4 sections. Section 1, some general issues. General issue number 1 is a question of method. When we're dealing with a question like the question this task force is wrestling with, do we begin from the top and reason down, or do we begin from the bottom, that is the actual problems, and then taking them as our material, basically reason up? This paper is very much top down, but it would be equally defensible, it seems to me, to have started with the last 9 pages of this paper, the problems, as opposed to the first 27, the concepts. And this is a distinction with a difference. If you begin with the concrete problems, you may be led in somewhat different conceptual directions. So that's general issue 1. General issue 2 is the overall assumed context for the conversation, which I will call plenipotentiary direct democracy. That is to say, a group of citizens who are fully empowered to answer and act on the questions before them. But of course, this is not the political world in which we're operating for the most part. We do not live in a Rousseauian direct democracy. We live in a representative constitutional democracy, which means that two other questions are critical, where, first of all, representation, where the question on the table is not what should we do ourselves, but rather whom should we choose to do it on our behalf. Those are not the same questions. And similarly, in a constitutional democracy, the question of what should we do is refracted through the question of who has the legitimate authority to do what. And these are critical questions for deliberation and decision making in the real world of representative constitutional democracy. Third, there is an issue lurking in this paper about the purposes of civic discourse. And there's the paper's official answer, and then there's the paper's, I think, fuller answer. The official answer is that civic discourse is a way of answering the question, what should we do? But as the paper proceeds, it becomes clear that there are three different functions or purposes of civic discourse that are working their way through this paper. The first is what I'll call formative, the most directly educational, and that is as we engage in certain practices, we are formed to become people of a certain character. And it probably is through the habitual repetition of these practices in classrooms and outside that helps to form us as the civic beings that we are. Second is the official topic of the paper, about which I'll have more to say, namely deliberative. But the third is what I'll call ameliorative. The paper at various points says that there is a form of civic discourse that is not directed towards decision and action, but rather towards mutual understanding and tolerance and the ability to coexist in the face of irresolvable disagreements. So those are three different functions, only one of which is deliberative in the strict sense. Section number 2 of my comments has to do with some conceptual issues, and in the interest of time, I'll just put them on the table. I have some, first of all, I have some questions with the way the paper deals with the concept of fact. The suggestion is that what we regard as a fact is always context dependent, institution dependent, experience dependent, and ultimately a matter of trust. And I can make a case for that proposition, but I also can make a case for facts that exist independent from all of those forces which, to be blunt, tend to relativize the concept of fact and to authorize the idea that facts are social constructions and therefore adjudication of facts is a purely social process. I do not believe that that is the only or best way of defining the idea of a fact. Second is the idea of the role of values in civic discourse, and there's a suggestion in this paper, well, that to the effect that, well, of course, in our kind of society, we advert to the values of equality and liberty and justice in order to motivate and shape deliberation, but farther down there's a suggestion that's also legitimate to question those values in the name of others. And I'd like to suggest that that makes deliberation impossible. That is to say, if someone in a discussion says, you know what, I really don't believe that all human beings are equal. Some are of greater moral worth than others. I think that's a conversation stopper. I mean, we can have a discussion about that, but I think it is more realistic to say that deliberation and decision are always functioning within a value horizon. I'll give you another example. Famous first three words of the Constitution, we the people. That is an assertion of the proposition that all legitimate authority comes directly or indirectly from the people. Now, throughout human history, lots of people have questioned that proposition. No, it comes from God. There's one good counterexample. And the purpose of government is to bring about the rule of God's word on earth. That is not an incoherent proposition, but I would submit to you that it stands outside the deliberative value horizon. And finally, this may surprise you a little bit, the list of civic virtues that we found on page 19 of this paper. Empathy, a willingness to compromise, a concern to look for consensus, a collaborative spirit, and civility. Those are Biden virtues. Are they Sanders virtues? Right? Is that the only or exclusive list of virtues? Let me give you an example from Supreme Court history. Justice Earl Warren worked extremely hard to find a consensus position on Brown v. Board that would lead to unanimity. He believed that that was critical to the legitimacy and ultimate acceptance and enactment of Brown as the lived experience of American society. But consider the case that Brown overturned, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. That was not a unanimous decision. It was 7-1. And the one was Justice John Marshall Harlan, who said, there's no way I'm going along with this consensus, because the idea that the Constitution of the United States, especially after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, authorizes this kind of separation and invidious distinction is just unacceptable to me. And if I have to dissent, I'll plant my flag. And that dissent, more than half a century later, was the seed that sprouted into the flower and then the tree of Brown v. Board. So, compromise, consensus, but maybe sometimes not. I finally have a question about the moral theory on page 12. And it's a moral theory that I agree with. So this is what might be called an argument against interest. Middle of page 12, we must be prepared to trade off one value for another or to resolve tensions between or among conflicting values when working in publics. Well, I happen to be a philosophical value pluralist, so that's exactly my position. But it's not John Rawls' position. Rawls says that there's certain things that you can't trade off against other things. So I think that as a practical matter, the idea of treating values as fungible and negotiable is a very good idea, but it's perfectly reputable to say that, well, maybe there's some things that simply can't be traded off. There's certain kinds of fundamental liberties that you can't trade off against anything else, no matter how valuable you think they are. The third section, and I'm afraid that I probably am running out of town. How am I doing, Madam Chairwoman? How much? 3 minutes? 3 or 4 minutes, fine. When we turn to deliberation itself, I think that that is the kind of discussion that could be nourished by attending to a philosophical tradition that does not make its appearance in this paper. And by that I mean the Aristotelian tradition, and specifically the very, very penetrating account of deliberation that we find in Aristotle's Ethics. Aristotle points out that deliberation concerns means to ends rather than the ends themselves, that it always reflects uncertainty. We don't deliberate in mathematics. We don't deliberate in astronomy. If we know as a matter of logic or science that things are as they are, then we try to find the truth, but we don't deliberate about them. So the element of uncertainty is built into the idea of deliberation. You're always trying to predict an uncertain future. I remember when I was part of the Clinton administration's welfare reform effort, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose credentials as a welfare expert were second to none, opined that if the bill were passed, by December of that year, 500,000 children would be sleeping on heating grates, quote unquote. Now, if that prediction had turned out to be accurate, it would have been a devastating critique of our efforts, but it didn't, right? And so it is always a matter of uncertainty. And finally, Aristotle points out there's always a question of feasibility. It would be nice to do X if we could, but what if we can't? Or how do we make judgments about what is feasible to do and what isn't? I could go on about deliberation. I won't. Let me, in my concluding minute, just point to what I regard as one very important omission in this paper dealing with civic discourse. There's a missing topic which oddly for millennia was thought to be the heart of civic discourse, mainly persuasion as opposed to deliberation, where you have a point of view and you're trying to persuade others that that point of view is the point of view that should be adopted by the group. Deliberation isn't simply a matter of fumbling around in the dark for a collective answer where nobody comes in with any answers about what to do. On the contrary, every deliberation I've ever been part of has been filled with people who already had clear ideas of what they thought the group should do. And they used mechanisms of persuasion in order to try to get the rest of the group to go along. And so deliberation is really, in my judgment, competing acts of persuasion. And so you need to try to not only incorporate the idea of persuasion into this, into this account, but also to give to offer an analysis of persuasion that is consistent with the lived reality of persuasive acts. Well, that's not all I have to say, but it's all the time I have to say it. So thank you for your attention.
Sure. So thank you, Dr. Galston, for very stimulating reflection on our panel, and thank you to the panel for really laying a great foundation for us to build common space and common definitions. I think the way we'll proceed is to take questions for those around the table here at the Keck Center, and also take questions for those online and start our dialogue. If you are online, it would be very helpful to us if you could send Diane Dong through chat a message about the topic that you would like to speak about. And also there should be a raise hand button on your screen if you can't see it, then also message Diane and we can help you find that. And then around the table, if you could vertically flip your name tag, and then we can help moderate the discussion in the room. I can't see them on mine. Do you have any questions so far? Okay. So far we don't have any online questions. So, that's your cue if you want to get to the head of the line. Now's the time to do that. And maybe we could start within the room if there are any comments, reflections, questions on the papers. Okay.
Got it. Okay, thanks. I just wanted to, oh yes, this is Catherine Wenzel from the University of Maryland. And I just wanted to expand a little bit on the discussant's comments about values. I agree that values are probably more central to deliberation and discussions in terms of being competing. We all enter deliberations with competing goals, competing shoulds, and what we think are important. So I think it's useful to think about virtues and values at that level. I also just wanted to add to the discussion of how to define value from a motivational perspective. So the paper focuses on the moral component of values. In my world, we talk about values as a motivational issue that may lead a school child to either engage in a task or not. And I think that's relevant to trying to understand, especially within educational systems, why some students try to engage in civic discourse or why not, which topics they choose to deem important and why not. Jackie Eccles, who's a member of your academy, is actually one of the early scholars who wrote about task values. So you can have values that reflect on the importance of a task. Is this something that is going to get me something in the future? What's the attainment value? Is it interesting or enjoyable? What's the cost benefit to engaging in this? So I think if we're talking about educational applications, these notions have direct implications for teaching, how teachers can make something enjoyable and interesting, or highlight the relevance of a civic topic or civic engagement or deliberation. So I just wanted to add that that is a strong motivational component as well when we talk about values.
Yes. Thank you, Catherine. I'm not quite sure what our format is here in terms of me jumping in, but thank you for bringing that to our attention, and I'll be sure to check out some of Jackie Ellis on that. But I think you're right that does raise the educational implications here, the pedagogical implications of what we're doing in the classroom when we actually engage values and how it relates to, you know, inviting students into spaces of civic discourse, appealing to their values as a way to invite them into that space, and you know, pivoting on their values to push and challenge them in new ways in civic discourse also.
The fakes, okay. So this is Carol. First I want to say that, Bill, that I really enjoyed your comments, and one of the things that is my takeaway that I think would be helpful both for this particular panel but for the entire workshop is that, and this is part of what I was trying to get at in the slides that I showed, is that the challenge, it seems to me, is that we are a society, we're trying to be a representational democracy when we have groups of people with very different values. And in many cases, values that are not easily amenable to one another. And groups of people motivated to pursue particular practices because their commitment to those beliefs are so essential to their perceptions of who they are and the sort of safety net, if you will. And one of the things that struck me, the image that you all had in the slide about democracy, and with all the little people, like, so most of the white people, and there were the colored people in there. And part of the challenge is that in the next, you know, few decades, that color dimension is going to be exactly the opposite. So I don't know if Elliot is on, Elliot Turiel. Elliot, are you there at all? Maybe not. But he's on our panel as someone who deals with issues of moral reasoning. Is the question of what's required to, when you're dealing with children and adolescents, since that's who we're trying to impact, when they are receiving one set of training, if you will, toward one set of beliefs, and you want to try in the public education sphere to help them to wrestle with a different set of beliefs.
Can I just speak to that for a second? So I appreciated the comments from Bill. Those were great. I think that in a way, what we're touching upon here is maybe a key difference between how the panel or our group saw the question of thinking about through civic deliberation and discourse, and clearly how Bill saw it, and maybe Carol too, the idea of you know, how to operate within a representative democracy. You know, as Bill said, who shouldn't we choose to do this work for us, or who has the authority to make decisions? And I don't know if I speak for the whole group, but I think that kind of narrows the scope where this civic interaction has happened unnecessarily to the political arena. And it's true that in the political arena, we see these competing values coming into play when we're talking about, say, gun rights and issues like that. But our hope was to broaden our view of where civic discourse happens, because civic discourse happens when we are trying to figure out as a university, what should our response to this virus outbreak be, for example, and we're thinking about what would be best for us as a community. And in those cases, there are competing values, but I think we're closer together than we might think. And so if we focus on the political arena where things are perhaps so partisan, I think we lose sight of the fact that civic engagement, civic deliberation permeates much of our everyday social world, and that in many cases, it is a question of what should we do together in this classroom, or this, you know, for this event in this high school, or in all sorts of other domains. So our hope was to broaden our view of what civic discourse and deliberation is and where it happens, rather than focus exclusively on the political, often partisan part of it.
All right, great. We have two people online. I know, Peter, you want to give a response to Bill Galston, but we also had Michelle Bellino, who was the first to raise your hand on the online space. So Michelle, if you wanted to go, and then I'll bring Peter in, and then we have some others around the room that also would like to talk.
Okay, great. I'm getting a little bit of an echo, but I will try to continue anyway. This question of what should we do has become sort of a central thread across all the papers, perhaps more than was initially anticipated. So I'm just wondering if we can hear a little bit more about this question, where it comes from. I understand it comes from Peter's work, but I'm not sure what the exact origin is. And, you know, can we really continue to wrestle with this idea of the tensions within the we? How expansive should this we be? Sorry, I'm getting texts from other folks in my panel. You have this example in the paper initially around the importance of civic deliberation around military intervention in the Middle East. So, for example, with this conversation, if we're talking about this issue, what does it mean to have that civic dialogue without the people in the room, or people, you know, who are going to be the most affected being part of that conversation?
Okay. And then if anyone in the panel wants to respond, and also Peter, you're next on our online list.
Peter, do you want to take this since it's centrally about your question?
Sure. Not all by myself, because this is a group project now, but I'm happy to address things. One thing is, I just want to thank my co-panelists. You guys did a great job, nicely organized too. I appreciate that. And then Bill, in a characteristic way, put all the important questions on the table, and they are the great questions. One of the questions is about, I thought of addressing two actually. One is the question about facts, but the other is the question about the we. And Jen began to address this actually by pointing out that we're nested in multiple we's at any given moment. And that's, I think, a contribution of the statement. So Bill asked if we're assuming that we are in one plenipotentiary direct democracy. And maybe we wrote it so that it came across like that, but I would definitely not want us to say that. The worldview that I would want to present is that we are in, that we as human beings are in multiple polycentric nested communities. You know, the example of this group, this particular group that's meeting today was raised earlier. I think Carol raised it, how we came up with a different plan for meeting. That's a group. It's within larger groups. So, and a couple of points. One is, or maybe several. One is not all those groups are democratic at all. So in fact, I don't think the National Academy of Education is democratic. At least it's not. I'm not a voting member of it. So, but it's a functional group and we can be civic in it. So civic and democracy have a relationship, but it's not an intrinsic one. So we're in lots of groups that are not democratic and we're still civic because we're still asking what should we do. Universities are not characteristically democratic. I think that the Republic is an important group that we're in, although some people aren't in it. And the borders of who's in and who's out of the Republic is a very critical civic question. But the Republic, and by the Republic, I just mean the res publica, the thing that we all own together. I don't mean that it needs to be set up in a Republican way, but actually when you get to a Republic of 300+ million people, you probably need to organize it as a constitutional democracy with limited powers and choices about who to select to govern on our behalf. The reason I think this is important is because we tend to teach civic education to kids so that the basic question is, what's this republic? What's the nation state and how is it governed? That's the basic question. So kids are taught what's America in complicated and interesting ways nowadays, but they're taught what's America and how is the government organized? And to me, it's backwards because I would say the question is, what should we do? What should we do in lots of different venues and different scales? One of the scales is the Federal Republic, which has got to be organized in certain ways, maybe should be organized in different ways, but is organized in certain ways. And then we should take seriously the question of what should we do there? So what we should do right now, for example, is probably pick presidential candidate and back that person. But that's only one of the things we should do with respect to the Republic. One of the things I'm worried about is that we tend to make this question much too easy. So we ask kids, we say that we're going to have an experience in deliberation in a high school classroom. And the question will be something like, what should we do about carbon, about climate change? And the answer is we should tax carbon. And the problem with that is that the kids in the classroom are not taxing carbon. They are not capable of taxing carbon. The we in the classroom is not authorized to tax carbon. So the real question is what should somebody else do, namely the government, but then an interesting question that follows from that is what should we do to affect the government? So we just need to be careful and explicit about the we's that we're in and out of and recognize that we're in a bunch of them. So that would be, and I think Jen started to say that, but it's an answer to Bill as well. While I'm talking, because then I'll shut up permanently. The other place where we would want to, I think, take a kind of moderate position is on the question of facts. So if we're communicating a kind of social constructivist view where people just make up the facts and nature is what we make of it, and there are no objective truths. I'm not on board with that. But I think the reality of dealing with something like climate change or the current virus or whatever is that we're in a social process of knowledge discovery, knowledge communication. So even if we're discovering rather than constructing knowledge, we're doing it under all kinds of socially specific constraints and limitations. And so things like trust become essential because I don't, for example, know a single thing about the virus directly. I only know them from various sources, and I know that the sources include the President of the United States, the CDC, a lot of different actors. And so my immediate task as a civic actor is not to sequence the virus myself, but to figure out what to trust. So that was more than I meant to say, so I'm going to mute myself.
I wanted to chime in on Peter's heels to pick up on Dr. Galston's point. I want to follow Jen in saying we're trying to expand beyond just this kind of political or government understanding of what should we do. But I also want to add in that part of navigating the we that Peter was just getting at, is it about, the government taxing carbon, or about what those, ninth graders in that classroom can actually do related to climate change, is about getting that know-how that I mentioned in the presentation that comes from having political and historical knowledge. So part of that political knowledge is having constitutional knowledge, right? Like who does what and how do they do it? So who's responsible for things? Ninth grade kids can't say we're going to tax carbon, but the government can. Who within the government can? Is this a legislator's thing? Is this an executive thing? That's the kind of knowledge that we'd be drawing on in our classrooms to empower those students to figure out who's the we here, what is the we that's beyond us, and what can be expected of them, and then what can we do with our limited powers and our limited abilities.
Great. I have Hi Bass next, and then Leo Casey.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So there are many interesting questions that were brought up, especially by Galston's presentation, but I want to point out something about trustworthy knowledge. Many of the issues that we're talking about, as was just explained, are too complex for personal expertise. So we, by default, have to depend on certain trusted sources. And that's become a kind of precarious sort of situation for most of us. But I would like to point out something that happened currently with the COVID-19 virus. There's lots of very confused information coming out about that. One area of expertise that people implicitly trust is medical expertise. The fact that we rely on physicians and other medical experts to even look after our own personal well-being. But there were a lot of confused messages that came out both from the administration and other sources that created a lot of uncertainty in the public. Now, the WHO, the World Health Organization, actually made a very interesting move that I think is instructive for us to mitigate that effect. Namely, they approached Facebook and Google, which use algorithms that decide what things come at the top of a list when you do a search for certain information. Those algorithms are based upon popularity of searches that look for those sites. And that caters basically to people that want to peddle things that have popular appeal and are frequently disinforming. So that's a good illustration of the fact that algorithms themselves are never value-free. They create advantage to certain kinds of actors. What the World Health Organization asked is that they place the WHO site at the top of those search listings when people do a search for information about the coronary virus. So that was a place where they're intervening on a system that favored disinformation in order to give advantage to basically a publicly trusted source of information. And just in the same way, the academies, of which this is one, but the National Academy of Science, of Medicine, of Engineering, those are historically trusted sources of knowledge, but in the public media, they are not the most advantaged by the public exposure to information sources. So that's an interesting model to indicate how one can possibly mitigate these effects of disinformation. I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Great, thanks, Hi. We also have Leo Casey.
So it seems to me that civic discourse, like all discourse, presupposes a common language. And by common language, we're not just talking about grammar, but shared understanding of the terms. And the paper, I think, does a good, and embedded in that shared understanding, I would also argue, our values. Yeah, I think the paper does a fairly good job of addressing one outside of that, which is people who have been excluded from that language, but want to invoke that language as grounds that they would be equal citizens. But what it doesn't discuss at all, and I don't know that we can really do that in this day and age, is those people who place themselves outside of that language to use a different language, like what occurs about a half mile from here, in which the common understandings of those terms are no longer in play. When people say, we live in a republic, not a democracy, without any sort of reference to the historical understanding of those terms, but as a way to defend a system of minority rule, they in effect are speaking a different language. And if we, if we're real about what happens with our teachers in schools today, they have to deal with that problem. They don't live in an ideal world in which this language is the only language which is operating. There's another language when even it uses the same terms is a very different language, and that's being contested. And I think, I would just say, I think that is something we have to figure out how to address. If this goes beyond the level of high level philosophical thinking to what actually happens in civics classrooms.
If there's time at the end, but I've already had my say, and there's a large task force here.
And then if folks in the room, if you could turn your microphones off, and I'm reminded of that probably more than anyone, it's creating an echo for the virtual participants. And do we have any more questions in the room? Judith Torning-Perza.
Is that the right button? Good. Thank you very much all for the papers and Bill for the comments. I'd like to, I'm sitting here as a member of the group that's going to have to figure out in the end, or help Greg figure out how to put this all together. And I want to try out a couple of ideas that might help, and I'm going to try to do this with each of the papers because I think that could be helpful to us. First of all, I want to note that many of the notions here need to be reflected in the fact that these are immature individuals that we are dealing with in classrooms. That's true to some extent even of teachers, but certainly of the students that we're dealing with. And we need to keep in mind how these issues, now some of them are important, the difference between conventional issues and moral issues, for example, is one thing that's dealt with in Carol's paper, and the fact that this is not, that this kind of reasoning is not co-natural to fifth graders, for example, because, and from some work there and elsewhere, we know that fifth, sixth, seventh graders are pretty important in this process. We can't wait until they're in high school. So certain factors of development and maturity have to be called into function. the notion of context dependence. Classrooms are places where students are trying to relate to their peers and find their position with relation to peers, and this makes a difference in ramifying these processes for the for use by anyone, and that's one of the things we try to do within our paper, but not explicitly. So that's something that we are going to need to look at. Also, there was one aspect of the paper that was not discussed that I thought was an interesting one, and I think is one that we will, as we go forward, perhaps want to look at. And that's the notion that this is not just a social studies issue, this issue of teaching or having students reason civically. And I thought one of the very interesting examples given was of citizen science within science. Now, this building where you're sitting has, from what I can tell, about every 6 months a conference on citizen science. It is we have somebody here who's working good. Those are attempts to actually make adults and adolescents and children understand science by participating in it, whether it's going out and sampling streams, or you get the idea. And that was one of the points that struck me in this paper. And I think it's one that was not explicitly dealt with, but I think is one that, that we ought to be thinking about. Thank you. And that's more, if anyone on the panel wants to comment on that, I'd welcome it, but it was not specifically a question.
I would just chime in to say that when we're talking about citizen science in the paper, part of the conversation surrounding that point of the paper is we're talking about how do children come to develop appropriate levels of trust in scientific communities, in organizations that help determine what facts are, and to become a part of those organizations to the extent possible through things like citizen science, but also understanding the criteria that we based whom we trust and what facts we find to be legitimate. So, you know, we're trying to reach beyond just social studies or history or government civics classes to talk about how that comes up in all sorts of disciplines in our schools, but also we're talking here about, you know, how we develop appreciation for facts and trust in those. Thank you.
Anyone else on the panel that would like to?
Yeah, can I weigh in a bit? So I think one question maybe about our panel. Sorry, I'm getting this echo. And it's a relation to the other ones is one value of philosophical accounting of what civic reasoning is and involves is to give a kind of fully fleshed out, mature picture of what it would look like when it's done well. And then there's a recognition that, of course, fifth graders aren't going to do it well, even if they're well trained and well educated, because they lack some of the psychological capacities to do it in a fully realized way. And so we might say, but knowing what it is we're aiming for will help shape what it is we're trying to do and where we're trying to do it in classrooms. So if civic reasoning is just how do I choose who to vote for, that's going to give one picture of what we should be doing in terms of training children into becoming good civic reasoners. If civic reasoning is how do I relate to other people as free and equal co-authors of collective decisions, all sorts of collective decisions, not just who we choose to represent ourselves, then there's a very different set of skills they need and a different set of developmental track that has to take, and a different role that these various contexts play. So I mean, I think it's bringing coherence to the whole set of papers makes sense, but it may be that the way to do that is for this particular paper to be couched at a more ideal level so as to make it clear what it is we're trying to develop and encourage.
Can I chime in following up on what Tony said? Okay, is the echo gone? Good. So I think that, yeah, as Tony articulated, part of our hope is to look for civic discourse beyond politics and thinking about you know, who to vote for. And I think the flip side of that too is that it's not just an exercise in ideal theory. So civic discourse happens and we see it around us successfully. And once we broaden the lens, I think we can also see how people that might feel excluded from the political process and who might not be political participants are engaging in civic discourse and can think of the skills and the values and the dispositions that you need for engaging in civic discourse as important ones to exercise, even if their interest in politics is not as you know, as great as it is for those who are much more invested in political activity. Of course, that's not to say that citizens shouldn't be thinking about the political realm and how they can participate in it, but that citizens and having good citizens around us involves much more than that. And so I think even in a non-ideal context, even of thinking about how what we see around us in terms of how citizens relate to each other, there are examples of successful civic discourse that maybe we should include in the paper and we should start thinking about that are not just geared towards the realm of politics.
Great, and we have a comment from the room.
Okay, thank you. This is Frank Gettridge from the National Public Education Support Fund. And I think I'm leaning on the thing that Bill said. Is this happening from the top down or bottom up? And I think that's the place where we need to consider in terms of how we move the work forward. And I think also Carol's point about raising up the historical challenges around this topic, because I think what often happens is we'll move into a discussion about something present day, and there is no conversation about the historical implications of that. And they are trigger words that can be said, not understanding how people are valued. I think as you move into a classroom, and I'm a former principal in Chicago, and I know that the students bring up these issues all the time. Issues about race, issues about what they hear about themselves and their identity on television. Teachers sometimes bring these issues up too. But I think when you talk about value in the school, civics education is not something that's valued necessarily within the school walls, more so than English and math, when you look at how time is allocated across the school. And so I think respecting the students and the teachers and understanding that they do want to talk about and engage in these things. And if we're having this conversation around how do we prepare them, then I think we get into issues of teacher preparation and principal preparation, which then you move into issues as whether or not the actual professors in the colleges have the capacity to engage in some of these discussions. I think we live in a very political environment. And at the moment you walk out of these school doors, the moment we walk out of these doors, it becomes political. But we want to talk about the topic sometimes in a very friendly and apolitical fashion. And I think that's not always the most helpful thing. There are other times that we can bring up more real world examples of how we may refer to people, how people may be characterized, and how those words pop up in different discussions that may trigger something in me, but may not trigger it in you because we have a different lived experience.
And we actually have, actually now my phone is starting to blow up with people wanting to be part of the conversation, but they're still setting up lunch. So we can go a little bit into lunch, and I could just give the order. Megan Bang and Sarah Friedman had been kind of on the queue to talk, and then I promised Bill Galston to say a concluding word for the session, and then we can transition into lunch. So Megan, you're up next.
There are two kinds of questions that I've been mulling over. Thank you for this really interesting discussion. So one is the general approach of defining the idealized version, while sensible in some ways, is not unlike Dr. Galston's original point about the method of this, where are we defining from sort of the ground up or starting from the up and defining down? And part of, I mean, I am on the developmental panel, so this might be predictable that I would ask this, but I do wonder about that and how it leads to a particular view of education only towards representational democracy, and why and how that representational democracy and how it's formed the who has been a long-standing challenge in the United States. And one that I think many of us are tacitly always aware of and suspect of. So I think there's a really interesting intertwining of this, of some of the definitional problems we're talking about with the lived realities that I heard also just reflected, that young people may not have the words in the way that we do, but they certainly have the intergenerational lived experience that a representational democracy is not purist. And so part of what I worry about here is that by starting out with an idealized state of civic reasoning and deliberation may not actually help the pedagogical challenges. And I know we have another panel thinking about that some, but I do think there's an interesting question definitionally to keep grappling with. I don't have a good suggestion about that, but I wanted to name that as a kind of thread that I'm hearing through this discussion. The second piece I did want to suggest that I think that it could come up is there's a little bit of language in the paper around naming, calling out, challenging power, and how the who has been powered in particular ways. And I want to suggest that pedagogically, naming power isn't enough to transform it. And that one of the questions, again, I think reflecting very much of the last comments, was I don't think that many instructors at the college level and or at the K-12 level actually know what to do to move beyond namings. And so some of what happens is you have avoidance of even naming. And so I think our pieces have to get into it is ethically demanded, I think, of us to do more than call out or challenge, but it is a work of reimagining. And some of this might be intertwined, and I certainly hope that we can actually push towards just naming power and balance isn't sufficient to get to civic discourse or deliberation. So I'm curious about, I'm wondering, I know that really wasn't stated as a question, but I'm curious about how the panel is thinking about and what other dimensions of kind of naming power and its transformations could be part of this.
I could only hear part of what you were saying, Megan. I think, we're certainly on board with your concern about doing more than just naming power inequities. And I think part of what we're trying to do when we talk about the skills and dispositions and habits that we're trying to develop in students, we tie them back to the sort of responsiveness that Tony's work draws on and the kind of ongoing commitment to deliberation and conversation and discussion. We're talking about how do we engage those spaces in ways that don't just call it out, but try to put forward some alternative, try to envision and enact something different and better than what is in the past. And so we're trying to identify, in the paper, what are those skills and knowledges that are going to help enable us to do more than just calling out power inequity. It's a limited response because I only heard part of the question, but hopefully that answers you a little bit.
Can I just say real quick? It would be helpful if people didn't think of the we in the paper as being the United States. It really isn't. It's a polycentric we. It's trying to challenge the idea that the we is the United States. So it's much more likely that the we is a social movement, for example, or a community that where all the members feel excluded from the traditional we. So if we can just decenter the conversation. It's a better reflection of what's in the paper.
So that's actually exactly my first point, is I'm with you about that. But that very ask, quite frankly, is a kind of privileged ask that people aren't living. And so part of what my point is I think you're right about that, and I get why we're there. My concern is what that positions educators to ask of young people who have not yet had the privilege to imagine what you just said. And so I understand, I don't disagree with you, and we are thinking about what is this for the here, right? The places that we are in. And that's why I said maybe the next panel will take some of this up. But that is partly my point about like whether or not we're starting from the kind of idealized, whether or not it's the US or not, and understanding how we're imagining that unfolding in the United States with young people now.
And then Sarah Friedman, you had your hand up for a while. Do you have a brief comment, or is it opening up a kind of a whole other discussion? We'd have to wait for another.
I'll make it really brief. And it's an issue that could come up in other papers as well, so it doesn't have to be dealt with here, but I would like to hear from the philosophers about values and moral relativism. And there's such a tension between what our values are and figuring out how to handle them and deal with consensus building. And so, how do we avoid moral relativism, but at the same time, how do we reach consensus if there are some moral imperatives? So that was I just wanted to put it on the table. If people want to have lunch, that's fine, but at some point.
Okay, great. So that's good feedback for the paper. Ooh, sure.
I was going to say something, but if you want to break for lunch, that's fine.
If you, we have like a minute or two if you want to comment on that.
Okay, let me try. I think one thing to keep in mind is any one of us might have a particular kind of philosophical, metaphysical, moral account of what the real values are, which values matter, which ones trump which ones, and so forth. And we don't have to be relativists to accept that when we're engaged in discussion with other people, they may not agree with us. And so there are two sort of competing things we have to think about. One is, how do we talk to people when they don't agree with us about our particular way of conceiving values, even if we're right? Right? I may have the truth, my view might be the true one. There may be facts about this, and I may be privy to them or be lucky to have aligned my views with them, but I'm still going to talk to people who don't agree with that, who don't see it that way. And so there's issues of persuasion, but there are also issues of accommodation. There's issues of humility about, do I just assume that I'm right, or do I listen to other people? Do I move off of where I am to reach agreements, even if that means giving up some bit of what turns out to be the truth or the proper ordering of values? And so I would want to make a distinction between sort of value pluralism, not in the sense Bill meant it, but in the sense that people come into the world and come into conversations with a variety of value orientations, and moral relativism, which says that thus they're all right. Right? I don't have to be a moral relativist to be respectful of other people's views, even when they're wrong.
Yeah, I get that. I just think it's really, really hard. And
it is hard, and it needs, I think the point is that
unpacking.
Seeing that then changes what it is you're trying to educate kids to do. You don't want to educate them to be moral relativists, but you do want to educate them to think about this activity of engaging with others who disagree with them, where that isn't just convincing them that you're right.
Right.
It's a different kind of thing to do.
I get that, but it's so easy in that process to devolve into some kind of moral relativism.
Yeah, it is, which is why, I think why it's really important to get this stuff right at the easy philosophical level.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think this is a really good
down into the messiness of education. You are less likely to go astray into it.
Yeah, this is a great area for cross dialogue between, actually, Sarah, your panel, which deals with identity and context. So hopefully we could continue this conversation during your panel's conversation tomorrow. And then, Bill, if you just want to spend a minute with your final comments.
Yeah. Peter Levine and I have been discussing these questions for more than a quarter of a century, so I'll take 99% of what I have to say offline. So let me just confine myself to one point, which is an example of the bottom-up approach. And that is, I take the point of the paper, and which Peter reiterated, that, that questions of truth and truth establishment tend to devolve into or evolve into, depending on your hierarchy, into questions of trust. The situation in which we find ourselves now is that substantial numbers of Americans disagree about whom to trust and on what basis. And so in the real world of civic education in the 21st century, I think we have to begin with the proposition that the old sources of trust that unified us have broken down, and that the presenting problem is multiple competing allegedly trustworthy authorities. And we can no longer presuppose what civic education of 50 years ago could. So what do, to be Levine-ish about it, what do we do?
All right. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, members of the panel. Sarah, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to close out by thanking, all of you for taking time to reflect on and think through our ideas this morning, and especially to Bill Galston for his careful review of our paper. We're, going to walk away with a lot more to talk about when it comes to the top-down, the bottom-up persuasion, which you're right is largely missing from the paper and certainly needs to work its way back in, perhaps through the way we talk about dissent in particular and how we make cases for alternative views. And then, pushing us to think more about whether we can even question or challenge some of the long-standing values like liberty and equality that make deliberation possible. So thanks for planting the seed of those ideas this morning.